On Tuesday, December 2nd, Netflix released a documentary that didn't feel like entertainment at all. Sean Combs, The Reckoning arrived quietly, without
We're
flashy
losing.
promotion, but within hours it was everywhere. 4 parts, one name, and a feeling that something irreversible had just been set in motion. Viewers didn't watch this series casually. They leaned forward, because from the opening minutes it was obvious. This wasn't about nostalgia, music, or legacy. This was about exposure. The documentary didn't rush. It didn't shout. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it knew the weight of what it was carrying. Old footage appeared first, moments that once felt harmless, even forgettable. But now, placed in context, those same moments felt different. Lingering shots, uncomfortable pauses, expressions that suddenly carried meaning no one wanted to notice before. And behind it all was 50 Cent, not loud, not on screen arguing, but present in the structure, the pacing, the strategy. This wasn't a hit piece thrown together for shock value. It was layered, calculated. Every revelation placed exactly where it would hurt the most. Not emotionally, structurally. As each part unfolded, the series revealed video clips that had never been shown publicly before. Not rumors, not recreations, actual footage, carefully dated, carefully placed. The kind of material that doesn't need commentary because it speaks on its own. Scenes people thought they understood suddenly felt disturbing when viewed without excuses attached. Then came the call recordings. Real conversations, real voices, calm, confident, almost casual. The documentary didn't interrupt them. It let them play. No background music, no narration, just silence afterward. And that silence was louder than anything said out loud. Because confidence like that only exists when someone believes nothing can touch them. Viewers across the world began reacting at the same time. Social media filled with clipped scenes, slowed down audio, screenshots of dates and timelines. Legal analysts started breaking down episodes frame by frame. Journalists reopened old files they hadn't looked at in years. The question shifted fast. Not, is this real? But how was this ignored? Before going deeper into this video, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That's how you'll never miss any breaking updates like this. Now let's get back to the story. What made The Reckoning feel dangerous wasn't just what it showed. It was how confident it was at showing it. There was no defensive tone, no hesitation. The series moved like it knew where it was going, and more importantly, like it knew what would happen once the world saw it. People stopped watching like fans. They watched like jurors. Media coverage exploded. Headlines changed tone. Words like allegations quietly disappeared, replaced by phrases like newly surfaced material and previously unseen evidence. Industry figures went silent. Some distanced themselves. Others deleted old posts. Silence, in moments like this, says everything. And while the public reaction grew louder, something else began happening quietly in the background. Legal eyes were watching, not reacting to outrage, evaluating substance. Because when evidence reaches this level of visibility, it stops being a documentary issue and starts becoming a legal one. By the end of the opening stretch, one thing was clear. The Reckoning wasn't closing a chapter on Sean Combs' story. It was opening a door that had been locked for years. A door that led far beyond Netflix, far beyond public opinion. Because once material like this enters the public record, control disappears. And when control disappears, consequences begin moving closer. What followed next is where the documentary stopped feeling like a story and started feeling like a case file being opened in public. The tone hardened, the pace slowed even more, and suddenly viewers realized they weren't being led toward a conclusion. They were being shown how one was built. The first thing that stood out was the footage, not recycled clips, not moments pulled from old interviews. These were videos that had never been broadcast, never analyzed, never debated on television. Some were years old, others felt uncomfortably recent. Each one was shown with dates, locations, and context that made it impossible to brush off as coincidence. Scenes that once looked ordinary now felt calculated when placed next to what happened afterward. The documentary didn't rush past them. It held the frame longer than expected. Long enough for expressions to change, long enough for viewers to notice details they had missed before. Body language, tone shifts, the way people reacted when certain names were mentioned. Small things, but small things that added up. Then came the phone calls, not summaries, not dramatizations, real recordings, voices steady, confident, almost relaxed. The kind of confidence that doesn't come from innocence. It comes from belief in protection. The series didn't interrupt the calls or explain them. It let them play in full. And when they ended, the silence that followed felt deliberate, like the documentary was daring viewers to sit with what they had just heard. What unsettled people most wasn't anger or threat. It was normalcy. These conversations didn't sound desperate. They sounded routine. And when those calls were placed against a timeline of events, a pattern began to emerge. One call here, an incident there, a consequence that followed quietly afterward, over and over again. Former insiders appeared next, not people chasing attention, not people reading from scripts, individuals who had once been close enough to see how decisions were really made. Some spoke cautiously, choosing words like they were still weighing risk. Others spoke with a calm that only comes when fear has already taken its toll. Different backgrounds, different years, same structure. One described a specific location. Another described the same place from a different time. One recalled a phone call. Another recalled the aftermath of that same conversation. They weren't coordinating. They didn't need to. The overlap happened naturally, and that's what made it difficult to ignore. Legal experts watching closely began pointing out something important. This wasn't edited like entertainment. Evidence wasn't scattered for shock. It was introduced methodically. Dates mattered. Sequence mattered. The documentary moved the way an argument moves when it's designed to withstand scrutiny. Online, the reaction shifted again. Shock turned into belief. Belief turned into urgency. People stopped arguing in comment sections and started asking why this material hadn't been examined years ago. Lawyers began commenting publicly. Journalists started revisiting old cases. Viewers tagged media outlets, not for opinions, for accountability. And hovering over all of it was one unsettling realization. This material didn't surface by accident. Someone had preserved it. Someone had protected it. And someone had waited until this exact moment to release it when it could no longer be ignored or quietly buried. By the time this part reached its final moments, control had clearly slipped away. The narrative was no longer being shaped by public statements or carefully worded denials. It was being driven by what had already been seen, heard, and recorded. And once that happens, there is no reversing the direction of the story. Only escalation. As the story continued, the documentary shifted its weight away from recordings and visuals and placed it squarely on the people who had lived in the shadows of power. This was the moment where the screen stopped feeling safe, where distance disappeared. Because now it wasn't evidence speaking, it was human beings. Faces appeared that most viewers had never seen before. Not celebrities, not public figures. Ordinary people whose lives had intersected with influence at the wrong moment. They didn't open with accusations. They opened with memories. How they were approached. How opportunities were framed. How trust was built slowly, carefully, until it no longer felt like a choice. What made these stories unsettling wasn't drama. It was familiarity. The way each account started calmly, almost casually, before revealing how control crept in. Invitations that felt professional. Meetings that felt routine. Promises that felt safe. And then the shift. Subtle at first, then undeniable. Several voices described different years, different cities, different circumstances, yet the same patterns kept emerging. Pressure masked as guidance. Silence rewarded. Resistance punished quietly. No one needed to use the same words for the meaning to be clear. Some admitted they had tried to speak up once. Not publicly, privately. To the wrong people, at the wrong time. Others said they watched what happened to those who spoke and learned quickly what survival required. The fear in their voices wasn't theatrical. It was practical, calculated. the kind that settles in when you realize power doesn't need to threaten loudly to be understood. The documentary didn't interrupt them. It didn't cut away when voices shook or sentences trailed off. Long pauses were left untouched. Hesitation stayed in the frame. Those moments said more than any
We're losing.
accusation ever could. Because truth doesn't always sound confident. Sometimes it sounds like someone pushing through years of restraint. What made it impossible to dismiss was how naturally these testimonies aligned with what had already been shown. Locations matched footage. Time frames matched call logs. Emotional reactions matched the tone captured in recordings. No one needed to draw the lines. Viewers connected them on their own. Experts appeared briefly, not to inflame the story, but to explain it. How power imbalance works, how consent becomes complicated when one side controls access, reputation, and future. How silence is often mistaken for acceptance when fear is involved. This wasn't commentary, it was context. Online, the reaction shifted again. An outrage gave way to recognition. People began saying the stories sounded familiar. Not identical, but close enough to be uncomfortable. Others admitted they had ignored rumors for years because they were easier to dismiss than to confront. Industry voices stayed quiet, and that quiet grew heavier by the minute. By this point, the documentary had crossed into territory that could not be undone. The conversation was no longer about whether these stories were believable. It was about why so many people had felt unable to tell them until now. And once that question takes hold, it doesn't fade. Because when multiple voices step forward independently, telling stories that echo each other without coordination, disbelief stops sounding reasonable. It starts sounding like denial. And with every testimony shared, the pressure didn't just increase, it deepened. Not fueled by outrage, but by consistency, by credibility, by the slow realization that silence had protected power far longer than truth ever should have. At that point, it became clear this story wasn't building toward a reveal anymore. It was already moving toward a reckoning that no one could stop. Once those voices were heard, the story refused to stay contained. What began as a documentary discussion turned into a full-scale public reckoning. Within hours, clips from the series flooded every major platform. Newsrooms shifted their schedules. Legal panels replaced entertainment segments. This was no longer being framed as a show. It was being examined as material with consequences. The language changed first. Commentators stopped saying viewers claim and started saying the footage shows. Analysts paused frames, replayed audio, and placed scenes next to timelines pulled from public records. Old reports that had gathered dust were suddenly relevant again. The more they compared, the harder it became to argue that what people were seeing was random or exaggerated. Social media pressure exploded, not in short bursts, but in waves that didn't die down. Viewers demanded accountability instead of reactions. Hashtags trended globally. People who had never followed the case before began asking why these stories had taken so long to reach daylight, and silence from powerful figures became impossible to ignore. Some distanced themselves quietly. Old photos disappeared. Statements were delayed. Others said nothing at all. But in moments like this, silence doesn't protect. It exposes. Because when everyone is watching, absence becomes a statement. Behind the public noise, something more serious was unfolding. Legal observers noted that the scale of reaction mattered, not because courts respond to outrage, but because they are obligated to respond when credible material gains widespread attention. This wasn't one allegation circulating in isolation. It was a convergence of evidence, testimony, and corroboration unfolding in real time. According to reports that surfaced shortly after the release, legal teams connected to past civil matters began reviewing the documentary professionally. Clips were cataloged, audio was transcribed, interviews were cross-checked, not to comment, but to assess relevance. Because once material enters the public record at this level, it changes how urgency is measured. Then came the development that quietly shifted everything. Cassie Ventura's legal team made contact, not through media, not through statements, through formal legal channels. The message was precise. Material revealed publicly, now aligned with information already known privately, and additional corroboration had begun to surface since the documentary aired. New confirmations, new connections. people recognizing their own experiences reflected back at them. That detail mattered more than most realize, because when public exposure breaks isolation, evidence multiplies. Individuals who once believed they were alone suddenly understand they were part of a pattern, and patterns demand scrutiny. Reports
We have
suggested
to
the
find
court was
somebody
paying
that'll
close
work with us
attention,
that has dealt in
not
the
reacting to
dirtiest of dirty
headlines, but to
business.
substance.
We're losing.
Media coverage wasn't slowing. It was intensifying. Every hour brought new analysis, new legal questions, new pressure for clarity. By the end of this stretch, the documentary had done something irreversible. It had shifted the burden. Ignoring the material no longer looked neutral, it looked deliberate. What started as a series had become a catalyst. And once that happens, the story no longer belongs to the screen. It moves forward, toward a place where decisions replace debates and accountability replaces silence. As the pressure intensified, the focus shifted away from public reaction and straight into the legal process that had been dormant for years. This was no longer about what people felt. It was about what could now be acted on. And behind the scenes, movement had already begun. Cassie Ventura's legal team stepped forward carefully, not emotionally. There were no interviews, no statements crafted for headlines. Just structured legal communication handled the way serious matters always are. According to reports circulating after the documentary's release, attorneys reviewed the newly surfaced material with one question in mind. Did this change the legal landscape? The answer wasn't immediate, but it was unsettling. What stood out wasn't just what had been shown publicly, it was what followed. After the documentary
We
aired,
have to find
individuals
somebody
began
that'll work
reaching
with
out
us that
quietly.
has dealt in
Some
the
recognized
dirtiest of dirty
locations,
business. We're
others
losing.
recognized voices. Some connected timelines they had never shared with anyone before. The series didn't create evidence, it activated it. That distinction mattered. Legal teams don't move based on outrage. They move when patterns emerge. And what was forming now was no longer isolated. Multiple points of overlap, independent confirmations, consistency across accounts that had never intersected before. That's when a case stops being theoretical and starts becoming actionable. Formal communication was made to the court, not framed as media pressure, but as a response to developments that could no longer be ignored. The concern was clear. Material now in the public record carried potential legal weight, and failing to examine it risked undermining trust in the system itself. Observers noted the shift almost immediately. Defense voices that once spoke confidently went quiet. No rapid denials, no aggressive rebuttals, just delay. And in moments like this, delay signals preparation. Legal analysts, watching closely, pointed out something critical. Courts are not obligated to react to public opinion, but they are obligated to respond when credible information surfaces that could affect sentencing, safety, or integrity. The line between documentary exposure and judicial responsibility had begun to blur. Behind closed doors, files were reopened. Archived material was cross-referenced. Conversations that had been shelved were brought back into focus. What once felt distant now felt imminent. The tone changed everywhere. This wasn't a spectacle anymore. It was process, slow, serious, unavoidable. And as the machinery of review quietly turned, one thing became clear to everyone paying attention. The story had entered a phase where outcomes mattered more than narratives. Because once legal systems begin to move, they don't do it for drama. They do it because something has crossed a threshold that cannot be walked back. What followed wasn't announced with headlines or press releases. It happened quietly, the way serious decisions usually do. Schedules shifted, communications tightened, and people who understood the system began to sense that something had changed behind the scenes. The court's attention was no longer hypothetical. According to those watching closely, the material now circulating wasn't being treated as noise or reaction. It was being examined line by line, stripped of commentary and evaluated for relevance. Footage was compared to records. Recordings were assessed for context. Testimonies were weighed for consistency. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about exposure to risk, and risk changes everything. Legal observers noted that when a case reaches this stage, silence becomes strategic. Defense teams stop speaking publicly not because they have nothing to say, but because every word suddenly matters. The confident posture seen earlier began to fade, replaced by careful positioning and internal focus. The weight of attention couldn't be ignored, not because of social media, but because of credibility. When multiple elements align independently, courts are forced to ask questions they can't postpone. What once looked settled now looked incomplete, and incomplete outcomes invite review. Behind closed doors, discussions reportedly centered on scope, not whether to look again, but how far. When material has the potential to affect sentencing, accountability, or public trust, the margin for inaction shrinks fast. Notices were prepared, internal reviews advanced, communication went out to relevant parties. Each step small on its own, but together they signaled momentum. The machinery had started turning. Those closest to the process understood what that meant. This wasn't routine. This wasn't procedural cleanup. This was escalation. The tension wasn't visible yet, but it was thick. Everyone involved knew that once formal review crosses a certain point, outcomes become unpredictable. And unpredictability is the last thing power relies on. By the time word spread that all sides were being called in, the gravity of the moment settled. This wasn't about revisiting arguments. It was about facing consequences that could no longer be deferred. The story had moved past commentary, past outrage, past reaction. It was now standing at the edge of decision. And when the system reaches that edge, it doesn't step back. It moves forward, and it takes everything with it. The moment arrived without drama, but it carried weight that everyone in the room could feel. Early morning, quiet hallways, a courtroom filled not with noise, but with anticipation. This was no longer about reactions or interpretations. This was about decisions. What had once lived on screens and headlines was now being addressed with precision. References were made, material acknowledged, timelines examined, nothing rushed, nothing theatrical. The process moved carefully, deliberately, as if every step was being taken with the understanding that what followed could not be undone. The atmosphere shifted as the scope became clear. This wasn't a routine review. This wasn't a procedural check. The information now before the court had altered the context entirely. What had once been treated as fragments was now understood as a pattern. What had once been isolated now appeared connected. And with that realization, the weight of responsibility changed. The defense approach reflected it. Responses were measured. Language was cautious. Confidence, once visible, had thinned. Every word felt chosen for protection rather than persuasion. When questions were raised, they were direct. When answers followed, they were careful. The balance in the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. Then came the acknowledgement that redefined everything. The court recognized that what had surfaced could no longer be treated as background or dismissed as noise. The consistency, the corroboration, the scale, it all pointed in one direction. The situation before them was no longer the same case it once had been. The foundation had changed. And when a foundation changes, outcomes follow. There was no outburst, no raised voice, just a pause, the kind that signals a decision forming, the kind that draws a line between before, and after. The path forward was altered in that moment. What had once been contained now expanded. What had once been limited now deepened. The implications were no longer theoretical. They were immediate, structural, consequential. Those watching closely understood what was happening. This was not symbolism. This was escalation, a recognition that the scope of accountability had grown and the system was responding accordingly. Outside reaction would come later. Headlines would follow. Opinions would clash. But inside that room, the shift had already occurred. The story was no longer moving toward explanation. It was moving toward consequence. And once that line is crossed, there is no return to comfort, no retreat to uncertainty. The process continues forward, guided not by noise or narrative, but by the weight of what can no longer be ignored. From that moment on, everything changed. The air in the room shifted the instant the final review concluded, not because of raised voices or dramatic reactions, but because everyone understood what the acknowledgement meant. The material was no longer being treated as contextual background. It had crossed into decisive weight. What unfolded next didn't feel sudden. It felt inevitable. The court moved with deliberation, referencing what had now been established rather than what had once been assumed. The conversation narrowed, of a memoir. The focus tightened. This wasn't about public reaction or media fallout anymore. It was about how the foundation of the case itself had changed. For the first time, the consequences being discussed matched the scale of what had been revealed. The defense shifted in real time. The posture was no longer about controlling narrative. It was about containment. Every response felt smaller against the gravity of what had accumulated. When the room fell quiet, it wasn't uncertainty that filled the space. It was understanding. This was the turning point. The moment where the system stopped treating this situation as manageable and began treating it as consequential, where outcomes that once felt unthinkable were now openly addressed, where the past no longer defined the limits of the future. No theatrics followed, just clarity. A decision was set into motion that reflected the full scope of what had surfaced, not symbolic, not provisional, something far more final in its implications. The shift wasn't just procedural, it was directional. From that point on, there was no path back to familiarity. The recognition alone carried weight, because when a system built on restraint chooses escalation, it does so knowing exactly what it signals. This wasn't about revisiting the past. It was about redefining what accountability now required. Outside the room, the reaction would come in waves. Headlines would compress the moment. Opinions would polarize.
We have to find somebody that'll work with us that has dealt in the dirtiest of dirty business.
The balance had
We're
tipped.
losing.
What once felt protected was now exposed. What once felt controlled was now moving beyond control. And the outcome, whatever form it would take, no longer belonged to speculation. It belonged to consequence. That realization settled slowly, but once it did, it was impossible to ignore. The story had crossed its point of no return, and from there forward, everything that followed would be shaped by this single moment, the moment where acknowledgement became action. The reckoning was no longer approaching, it had arrived.